have an amazing story in many different aspects. So it's going to be fun for people to listen. I think there's almost something for everyone here.
That was like the early in the Amazon FBA boom. Started out, kind of bought a case of something and tried listing that and selling it. And over the course of about 3 years, built that up to just over $10 million in annual revenue.
Do I go after what I'm an expert in, or do I go after where I see gaps and try to fill them?
During the super growth period of my pet supplies business, I bought another business, probably lost close to $1 million overall.
$1 million lost on tutus. Oh, that's a tough story. You did get into software. Let's talk about that.
If you can find a business that's still using a fax machine, like that's a good opportunity. And so realized, hey, if we could find a more efficient way to help veterinary practices communicate with pharmacies, that could be a win. And ended up selling that kind of very early.
I mean, we've only covered a handful of things. Like, you got a New York Times article that you published. You've written several books, to my knowledge.
It takes hard work and takes choosing to work on something instead of watching a TV series at night.
What are some insights you have about that? Like, why do you say that e-commerce is different now, and maybe what from a high level is different about it?
Yeah, I think it's...
All right, welcome back to the Niche Pursuits podcast. My name is Jared Baum, and today we're joined by Elliott Garber. Elliot, welcome on board.
Hey, thank you. It's great to be here.
We were talking before we hit record, and this will oftentimes come up. It came up with you as well, that you're a listener of the podcast. I liked your little touch, though. We haven't heard this before. Maybe start by sharing that little fun history point about your listenership, but really get into your backstory, if you could. Tell us about yourself. You've got a really fun background, not just as a listener, your background in your work and your online ventures. So let's get into that, and then we'll unfold how the day is going to go.
Yeah, sounds good. So yeah, what I shared before we started recording here was that even still now, when I feel like browser bookmarks are kind of a thing of the past, I have across the top of my browser here in Chrome, niche pursuits. I don't know how you like to say it, but
either way is fine.
Right there as the second browser bookmark across the top. So it's in my mind, in my eye every day. And I haven't listened to every episode, but been a longtime follower of the team on Twitter and the podcast. So I really enjoy all the learnings I've taken over the years from that. So yeah, thank you guys for that.
It's fun to hear, but it's great to have you. And I mean, looking over kind of the agenda we created going back and forth today, like, you just have an amazing story in many different aspects. So it's going to be fun for people to listen. I think there's almost something for everyone here in terms of how you've gone about your online journey as it kind of pairs up with your, we'll call it desk job 9 to 5, whatever you want to call it. And I say desk job tongue in cheek because of what I know some of your backstory is. Why don't you get into it and tell us a little bit about not only where you started, but then where the online venture started in as well.
Yeah. So thankfully I've never really had a desk job. And don't think I do well in that. I love to have my hand in a bunch of different pots at once and working on a variety of things. So as a background as a professional, I'm a veterinarian. Went to vet school up in the Boston area at Tufts and got a scholarship during vet school from the military, and had no family background in the military. Had been since World War II. My grandfathers fought, but somehow the next generation missed Vietnam, et cetera. So wasn't something I had considered at all, but I was either faced with kind of coming out of vet school with $300,000 worth of debt or looking at other options. And really the one interesting option to me was this Army scholarship. So it's the same way that kind of most doctors and dentists and other healthcare professionals end up doing some time in the military. Is they pay for your professional training and then you owe them a certain amount of time afterwards. So did that with some trepidation. Felt like I was kind of signing my life away for a few years, and realistically, that's what you're doing. But I was ready for the adventure, and so ended up spending 8 years on active duty as a veterinarian in the Army. One kind of fun thing about the veterinary corps is that we serve all the branches of the Department of Defense. So I spent 6 of my 8 years working under Navy commands rather than Army, which, sorry to the Army, but the Navy is in better places in the world, generally has nicer facilities. Army has the big places in the middle of the country, which are cool in their own way, but Navy is generally next to the water, which is nice. So we spent 3 years in Sicily island in Italy, and then went from there to Coronado, California, where I was with the Navy SEALs, Naval Special Warfare Command, for 3 years, and serving as the force veterinarian there. And so, yeah, it was really honored to have that opportunity to serve with them, and got to deploy to Iraq with the SEALs. And for the listeners out there who may be wondering, SEALs, does that mean like the marine mammals? No, although the Navy does use marine mammals in other contexts. The Navy SEALs are the human operators, and they use dogs in pretty much all of their missions. And so it's really important for the dog handler SEALs to be prepared to face whatever kind of sickness or emergency situation they might with their dog while they're out anywhere in the world where I'm probably not going to be with them. And so a lot of my job was helping them be prepared for those types of scenarios to take care of their dog.
Hey everyone, Spencer here, founder of the Niche Pursuits podcast. Last year, the traffic to nichepursuits.com more than tripled, with most of those gains coming from Google. In fact, I finally hit the 1 million page views per month milestone. In order to achieve this growth, my team and I publish over 100 articles a month. The final step for each of those articles? We build at least one new internal link to that article using Link Whisper. This helps index it faster and helps it rank better in Google. This also helps us avoid having any orphaned posts in the future. If you want to give your new articles the best chance possible, you need to build a process around internal linking when you publish. It only takes a few seconds with Link Whisper to get suggestions and check the box next to the internal links you want. They are all built automatically once you've made your selections. No need to go into each article, find a relevant sentence, highlight the anchor text, and add the internal link. Link Whisper does all this automatically once you've made your selection. If you want to try out Link Whisper, just head over to linkwhisper.com and use coupon code podcast at checkout in order to get $15 off.
I feel like we could do a whole podcast just on your stories and your findings from those types of things. I mean, you know, SEALs are known as the highest elite operators in the world, and you had a privilege to be alongside them. I mean, and by the way, I'm from San Diego, so we have a strong SEAL connection here because I know all the training happens at the Coronado base, which is not far from my home right now. But what I want to know is, because like I said, we could get into so many stories there, but as it relates to your future endeavors and, you know, cat's out of the bag, your future online endeavors, whether it was with the Army or specifically with some of your deployments or specifically with the SEALs and being kind of a special operating class, like what did you learn? Any insights you learned that maybe the typical online entrepreneur wouldn't be able to get from their job? What did you bring with you that helped your online journey?
Yeah, good questions. I think one of the kind of most influential things on my journey in the military was going from kind of what we call the big army or the big military, which is the traditional force side of things, into the special operations community. And it's really just kind of a night and day difference in how people are treated and the responsibilities that you have. In the special operations community, they kind of joke around that you get to play by big boy rules, and people just expect that you're going to do your job. You're aligned on the ultimate goal and mission, and so you don't need to micromanage. And that's the opposite of the big military, where there is a lot of micromanagement and very strict directives about this is exactly what you're going to do, and this is exactly what you're not going to do. And I think for me, as an entrepreneur at heart, it fits a lot better in the special operations side, where I understand what my role is and what I need to get done, and have a lot of flexibility in figuring out the right way to do that and the most efficient ways to do that. And so that was really helpful for me. After the time with the SEALs, I realized I couldn't imagine going back to the big military side of things. And so that's why I finished up my time on active duty and transitioned into the Army Reserve so that I could pursue my entrepreneurial stuff full time.
In many ways, as a veterinarian, especially with the special forces, like you've kind of served in some of the biggest capacities, what was the drive to move into an entrepreneurship journey? I mean, I've got to imagine that a resume potentially like that looks great, and you have so many opportunities in front of you to just stick with traditional veterinarian practice. I know at my agency, we work with a number of veterinarians, and it's you can have a big impact in your community. It can be very lucrative. Like, what was the draw to going into some of these online ventures we're going to get into?
Yeah, so I realized over time that I really was an entrepreneur at heart. And as a child, I had always been dreaming up ways of kind of combining my love for animals and making money. And then that kind of dropped off as I began my professional journey in college and through vet school and the army, which is kind of, for most people, would be kind of the opposite of being entrepreneurial. But as a vet, I also am a little bit unique in that I didn't ever imagine myself working full time in a traditional kind of dog and cat clinical practice. I knew that for me, I think I'd get tired of kind of doing the same sets of things every day, 5 days a week. Although there are a lot of people who, yeah, like you said, run great businesses doing that. And I'm glad that there are people like that out there, because I use them for my own animals when I need additional assistance with that. But I always kind of was thinking more veterinary medicine, the big picture of how animal health impacts human health and the economy and environmental health. And so as I was looking at getting off of active duty in the military, my options were more kind of going to continue in the federal government in another agency like the USDA or USAID. I applied to a job kind of working in an infectious disease research lab in the country of Georgia. Now,
Oh, wow.
post COVID, there's a lot more awareness of the fact that animal diseases can affect humans as well. And some of that could happen naturally through natural transmission. Sometimes maybe it could have come from lab experiments gone wrong. So I think that, interestingly, there's more awareness of that. But yeah, I think for me, I knew that I needed to go out and kind of try my hand at doing my own thing. And so I had various blogs along the way. Kind of was early in AOL as a middle schooler. My initial handles football 12 when I was 12, and then Swish 14 when I was 14. And so thankfully my parents had given us enough kind of flexibility to begin experimenting in those worlds early on, and just had a good awareness of what was possible out there in the wider world of the internet.
Let's talk about where you launched off. Like, where you had a couple ventures. What was the first one? And talk about its early beginnings, and then maybe some of the first things to kind of hit or go well with it.
Yeah, so the first real online business I did, it was just as I was finishing up my time on active duty in the military, and was thinking about kind of what was next, and started digging in more on some of the learning from online business folks like Spencer and the team. And um, basically at that was like the early in the Amazon FBA
Yeah.
boom time. And so it seemed like, hey, this is a pretty potentially easy, obvious way to get started with it. And so I had an advantage there, because as a veterinarian, I could easily get accounts with a variety of kind of pet supply distributors. And so started out, kind of bought a case of something and tried listing that and selling it, and saw, hey, this works. And then bumped it up to a couple cases, and over a few months went up to spending more money on credit cards than I had ever done in my life. And kept working, selling it on Amazon. Eventually, over the course of a couple years, I kind of transitioned from just being an Amazon reseller to providing kind of more comprehensive e-commerce marketing agency type resources to manufacturers in the pet supply space. And so I would help them with their strategy on selling on Amazon and on Walmart and on their own e-commerce sites. Because basically during that time, it was kind of the Wild West of everyone trying to get their hands on everything. And so I was in a unique position in being able to kind of offer my expertise on that, along with my background as a veterinarian and animal lover, to these companies. And so kind of built up a little group of manufacturers that I was working with, and able to both sell their stuff on Amazon primarily, and also help them with that strategy and kind of control over their distribution. And so that business has been the biggest one and the most successful that I have done so far. And over the course of about 3 years, built that up to just over $10 million in annual revenue, which is crazy to think about. But when you're selling volume on Amazon, it happens more easily than you might imagine. And of course, the margins are very slim
Yep.
there. And so it's a very risky business too. And I think that that's something I'd want to really hammer home to your listeners, is that for a lot of my success is because I have been willing to kind of build up a little bit of a risk tolerance. And I think for me, coming from a very like standard middle class background, parents who've worked traditional jobs, our house is our biggest asset and still is. And there's never any conception of owning a business or entrepreneurship. For me, I don't know if I was born with it or if I've taken kind of one little incremental step along the way, but being willing to take those risks has been what set me up for the success now that I've experienced. That said, I got married pretty early and started having kids early. I have 5 kids now, ages 3 to 13. And had kids when I got off active duty and started this entrepreneurial journey. So didn't want to go completely crazy and risk everything. And so that was partly why I decided to stay in the Army Reserve. And that's something I'd encourage people to think about too, even though it may seem totally out there and crazy, but there's pretty much every job you can imagine in the military. Most people think, oh, you're a soldier, you're shooting people, whatever. But actually there's all sorts of administrative jobs. It's a huge organization that needs everything out there under the sun. And so the reserves has been really great for our family in providing kind of that underlying foundation of stability as I've done this entrepreneurial thing, because it provides healthcare and a potential retirement package. And at the end of the day, I'm not going to be kind of out on the street and destitute, even if my business had totally crashed and burned.
Couple things I want to hit on. Let me start with the 3 years to 8 figures.
Yeah.
I'll say you glossed over it, not because you were wrong, because you were kind of giving us a high level. I want to get in and ask, I guess, the high level question, which is what was the turning point? Because 8 figures, even though it is e-commerce and we're talking revenue, and as you said, like once you start really hitting on Amazon, like you can really churn out a high volume of products, and that's not profit, that's revenue, but still 8 figures a year on Amazon selling products through an e-commerce platform is not easy. What were some of the things that allowed you to kind of create that lift and separated you from all the other people that were selling much less volume?
Yeah, I think I did a combination of things. So I had a private label myself that basically I just through kind of my own research identified products that I thought that there was a demand for a specific product in the pet space, whether it's a certain kind of treat or accessory, something like that, that wasn't being marketed well. And I thought that even though me as a non-marketer, I could hire a few freelancers to get me the stuff I needed to put it out there in a more effective way. So I had the private label side of it, but the bigger part of the business was just the straight up reseller. And I think that was all about my relationship with the distributors. And so honestly, I kind of hate to even get into all the details now, because I'm not sure it's an opportunity anymore for people.
Right. Yeah.
Because most of these manufacturers and brand owners have a much better handle and control over their distribution now. But like I said, at that time, it was just when Amazon FBA was taking off. And so there were a lot of products that the manufacturers had no idea where they were selling or how much they were selling. So not to say someone couldn't be successful with that now, but I do think it would be more difficult than it was for me.
This theme will come up, I think, throughout the rest of the interview. So I'll ask it now. And I'm sure a lot of people listening are going to have this question. Like, how important to your ventures and their success has it been to actually be a veterinarian with that experience? You've focused your efforts online to solve problems that you see in your, again, I'll say your day job, right? Like your expertise. A lot of us online are using our expertise from our day job or our past experiences to create online businesses. And then a lot of us aren't. We're looking for gaps in the market, right? We're looking to see if we can fulfill them. I mean, speaking of e-com and Spencer kind of had this great Amazon business around pillows, right? And I don't know if Spencer was here, I'd ask him, but I don't think he's a pillow expert, right? So there's kind of this dichotomy of like, do I go after what I'm an expert in, or do I go after where I see gaps and try to fill them? You've always gone after your expertise. How influential has that been, or has it been that big of a deal at all when you look back on some of these ventures like this e-commerce business you're talking about?
Yeah, I think for me, being a vet hasn't been the reason that I've been successful or not with these things. I think it's more that that's my own actual passion in
Mhm.
life is I love hanging around with animals and animal people like me. And so that's more of the importance. It's not the actual degree or experience or learning I had as a vet as much on that side of it. Um, I think the biggest way that I kind of figured that out is that I thought that I had kind of figured e-commerce and Amazon out. And so during the super growth period of my pet supplies business, I bought another business that was primarily e-commerce on Amazon product sales from one of the major brokers, a women's clothing manufacturer based here in the US, which I like the idea of. It had a long history. There's an actual like manufacturing plant down in the boonies in Tennessee. And the brands were some unique kind of niche women's clothing. So for dancing, like tutus and petticoats and some really high quality stuff. But realistically, I should have realized like I had no personal interest or background in these products, and I really didn't have any reason to connect with the customers or buyers of those products. Even though my 7-year-old daughter enjoyed wearing the tutus and playing
Yep.
around with them, but that contributed in a big way to the fact that I just couldn't bring myself to put the time or energy into actually making that business successful. So going back to your initial question there, I think the fact that I'm a veterinarian is more a result of the fact that I love animals and love animal people and animal products. And so that's what's made me successful is having that actual kind of passion for something, problems that I want to solve and be involved in. And so that clothing business I ended up selling again just a year and a half after I bought it, and probably lost close to $1 million overall in the whole operation. So that was a great lesson for me, a very stressful period. So thankful that ended up finding a buyer. Is a big Indian e-commerce company, which the brands are still going now. The products are made in India rather than in the US. But it's good to see that it still exists in some way.
$1 million lost on tutus. Oh, that's a tough
I know
story.
it's crazy. Yeah. And it's another, I should have known now seeing that like 80% of the sales were in the week leading up to Halloween, which I wouldn't have thought because people buy tutus for Halloween. Now I realize
Wow.
that is just such a crazy type of business to get in physical
Yeah.
products that have to be planned for and manufactured that come in different sizes and colors and styles. Yeah.
That kind of seasonality is brutal in the online space, right? But now you're managing inventory on top of that. That is almost insurmountable in many ways.
Yeah, I thought more of myself than I actually could handle.
Well, there's a couple things there. I mean, I'm glad you highlighted. I asked if the reason you were successful with your original pet e-commerce business was because you were an expert or because you saw a gap. And the reality is you pointed out a third thing, which is you had a passion for it. And then you ended up buying something that you had no passion for. And so it didn't go very well. There were probably other reasons as well. Uh, what ended up becoming of your online pet e-commerce brand, and where did that end up going? Because unlike the tutu business, it sounds like that one did pretty well for you overall.
Yeah, it was still kind of at the end of the day, not a huge home run, but definitely set me up for success in a way I could never have imagined in my life before that. So it was right over the course of a couple months that I ended up selling 3 businesses all at once. So that was a really crazy, stressful time. Kind of it was 6 months into the COVID pandemic, and maybe I don't know if that impacted my desire to just move on and get settled with something else. But so the pet supplies business ended up selling. I had been looking into listing it through one of the brokers, and was all set to do that. But a friend of a friend kind of connected me with a successful founder and CEO of a few different pet businesses, and he was looking to bring in something like this to kind of kickstart their e-commerce operations. And so at the end of the day, sold the business to his operation and kind of joined them for a 6-month transition period. And that wasn't easy either. It was stressful, kind of handing over all the relationships I had developed. And in that business, I had been doing it completely solo until kind of the last year of it. I hired a kind of freelance operations director guy. And so it was just me and a part-time kind of operations guy who built up this big business. So it was a lot to hand over. And I learned some lessons through that acquisition. That was the first kind of real big business I had sold. And so probably would have structured things a little differently and gotten some better counsel on how to set that all up after the fact, but had an earn out that ended up doing okay. The business is still trucking along, doing well. And I sold it, and then it got sold a year and a half later to a publicly traded company, one of the biggest companies in the vet industry. And so that was, yeah, at the end of the day, a pretty successful story, even though, like I said, a lot of stress, a lot of risk involved along the way. So I'm thankful looking back that I went through all that. And that helped to build my family a new house and bought my dream farm property out in the mountains in Virginia here. And so all that stuff never could have even imagined without doing that. But yeah, it's not for everyone, that's for sure.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Huge. I think one thing about your story that's interesting is that, you have this big success, but you also shared that you also had a failure. And so I think it's really important. Like, the more I interview entrepreneurs every week, right? And all of them tend to have failures. And it's not about letting your failures define you to some degree. It's about making sure you also have those successes, right? But it is to some degree about taking swings at the plate. And like you talked about how e-commerce maybe nowadays isn't as simple or just isn't the same. And I know that your time frames of when you were selling 2020, 2021, those time periods were huge for the e-commerce space, right? The aggregators were rolling up a lot of these e-commerce brands and offering really high multiples and stuff. Maybe some insights you could share before we move on to some of your other entrepreneurial journeys? What are some insights you have about that? Like, why do you say that e-commerce is different now, and maybe what from a high level is different about it?
Yeah, I think it's a more mature industry now. And so when you have a lot more money involved, you have better operators and bigger businesses that are trying to compete with you on it. So I think, yeah, I wouldn't want to be getting into just that myself now. That doesn't mean that other people shouldn't, but I think there are natural kind of swings in terms of what businesses are easier to be successful with. And also it was just kind of after my experience, after 4 years of handling physical products, like opening thousands of boxes myself and labeling and polybagging products, like more hours than you could imagine. Like, why is a veterinarian doing that kind of stupid work? But I had to do what I had to do to make it work. Handling physical products made me kind of come to a hard stop conclusion at the end of that. You know what? I want to do digital products from now on. And I had, seen some friends who were getting more into the software side of businesses. And so just made a decision. I'm done with physical products for a while. I'm going to try my hand at the software space. And I think even from long before I started in e-commerce, software has always been potentially an easier business to be successful in if you could build it. And I'm not a coder, I'm not a developer, so I couldn't build it myself. And it's super expensive to build traditionally. And so I think now, just in the last year, something that I'm super excited about is that the software space is opening up in a big way for entrepreneurs of all varieties, even if you aren't naturally prone to wanting to build the code yourself. And so that kind of goes into the new project that I'm working on, which we can get into later. But that was a lot of why I just was ready to be done with e-commerce, was that there are a lot more money involved, a lot bigger players, And I was just tired myself of having to worry about where these boxes going to sit until I can sell them.
You'd make for a good podcast host, Elliot. That's a good transition. Let's get into this software. You kind of teased everybody, and that was next on my list. There's a third business here, right? We've got the e-commerce pet supply business. We've got the female clothing business. You did get into software. Let's talk about that. Maybe give us the origin story of the software, where you came up with the idea, where that was in your journey as it relates to some of these other businesses, and then we'll kind of talk about where the software is.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I can't claim any great genius on my part with this because I literally was just taking what guys like Spencer and Pat Flynn and, and the other gurus back in the day were talking about. And so basically heard this over and over, like you can find a problem by just hanging out in a little community where people are talking about their problems. And as a vet, the natural place for me for that was veterinary groups on Facebook. And so I just, over a few months, as I was kind of preparing to sell the e-commerce businesses and try to move on from that, started spending a lot more time hanging out in Facebook groups and seeing what people were talking about and what people were complaining about. And one of the constant refrains for veterinarians, which again, this is totally kind of a niche problem that most of the crowd won't appreciate, but as a veterinary community, we haven't had a way to send prescriptions to pharmacies electronically. And so it seems like you probably in the entrepreneur business crowd, you hear like, if you can find a business that's still using a fax machine, like that's a good opportunity. And again, that's something I heard over and over. And I was like, wait a second, most vet practices are getting tons of faxes every day. And so realized, hey, if we could find a more efficient way to help veterinary practices communicate with pharmacies through electronic prescriptions, that could be a win and kind of a very discrete problem that you could try to fix and focus on. And so I decided I was going to pick that up. And again, I took the approach of kind of, if you build it, they will come. And sometimes that's failed and sometimes it's been successful. But I kind of talked to everyone that I could about the problem. I set up a website, a nice website, made it look like I was a legitimate business getting started, which I was to whatever degree, and established myself as kind of the go-to guy who actually knew about veterinary prescriptions and electronic prescribing to pharmacies and things like that. And that was all just my own research in the late hours of the night, reading online, everything that I could about it. And so set that up and ended up selling that kind of very early business project. This one, it was more of kind of an acqui-hire. It was they wanted me rather than whatever business I had developed, because like I said, I wasn't a coder. And so I didn't actually have the software that was going to solve the problem. I needed to figure out how to do that. But I was about to try to raise some funding and hire some developers and build it myself when a veterinary software company ended up buying that project with me in an acqui-hire. And that has worked out really well for all of us, I think. It's pretty early in the company. There were about 20 people when I joined 4 years ago. Now we're at about 150 people, have an amazing portfolio of projects, software projects, solving problems in the veterinary space. The company's called Instinct Science, and really love the team and the work that I'm doing there. But after about 3 years of doing that full time as a traditional W-2 employee, although still working remote and really flexible schedule, I couldn't stop myself from seeing another problem that needed solved. And so it was a little bit more complicated because I'm a full-time employee of another company, but got permission to start up a new kind of side hustle. Actually, I closed down another e-commerce business that I had been working on the sides for a few years last year, and kind of said, you know what, I'm going to shut this one down. Can I start up a new side hustle to take its place? And so that's where I am now, is I'm still working full time for this veterinary software company, which I love. And then in the evenings and weekend time, when I can find the space, working on something new, which is exciting.
What are you doing right now? for your for your full-time job? Because you talked about how you don't have a lot of experience necessarily with software, but you were doing software. You kind of got acqui-hired as you're starting software, but you don't really do software. What are you doing right now with this company? And how's the transition been to W-2 life? I mean, you had been on your own for a while, granted, still a reservist in the Army, but like, I mean, how's that transition been?
Yeah. So like I said, it's as good as it could get for someone like me. It was a fully remote company even before COVID, and the founders felt strongly about kind of a very flexible work-life balance. And again, kind of playing by those same big boy rules that I got used to in the special operations community, where you're getting your job done, and it doesn't really matter if you're doing it from 9 to 5, or if you prefer to work for a couple hours every night, fill in the gaps on the weekends or whatever. And so with that company, I have been more on, as you can imagine, more on the business development and partnership side of things. So I get to do what I love doing already, which is staying in touch with everyone in the veterinary space who's working on cool new technology and figuring out how we can work together with our companies. And so it's been a really great from that perspective.
Through this whole time, and to my understanding, you're still in the reserves with the Army Reserves, right? If either way, through all of this entrepreneurial highs, lows, everything in between, you had that fallback, as you described it. You had that reserve, and it covered a lot of things for you. Talk about that, especially as people listening are wondering the when and the how of diving into their online journey, their side hustle, whatever it is, and trying to figure out how they wrestle with keeping their full-time job or transitioning into something that's a little more part-time. Like, you have a unique story. You've done a lot, but you've kind of had a bit of a safety net behind you as you do it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I know it's kind of unique. It's not something that would work for everyone, but it is, I think, a great opportunity. I mean, I'll put my recruiter hat on and say that probably a lot more people could look into it than might have ever considered it before. I think not only the benefits while you're a reservist, but also as a veteran in the military. I mean, it's basically the best benefit programs that are out there in our country and the world, that our country has chosen for now. We'll see if that continues to really take good care of people who have been willing to step up and defend the country and pursue our interests around the world when we want to do that. So yeah, that's been a big part of my story. And like I said, I don't know if I would have been willing to take as many risks, or if my wife would have been supportive of that, without kind of having this kind of underlying basic kind of poverty level taken care of. Like, we're not
Yeah,
totally
it's not lucrative
yeah.
when we describe it, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Good. Another theme I keep seeing is it seems like you always seem to know someone when the time comes to make that next transition. You talked about selling the first business, the pet supply e-commerce. I believe you mentioned that you had a friend of a friend that you got connected with. You talk about being fortunate enough to find a buyer for the clothing e-commerce business. You then talked about pre-market, before you even had a product, you were acqui-hired, and like what role has your network played? Is that something that you develop and tap into? And how influential has that been for all these successes?
Yeah, that's been huge. And I'm glad you remembered to kind of come back to that, because that's one of the points I wanted to hammer home, is something that I feel like I really needed to hear a lot of times until I was willing to try it, was this whole concept of kind of the platform, building a platform for yourself. And yes, I'm a veterinarian, and so maybe people feel like that's kind of an unfair advantage, and that does give me something unique about me. But I did have to decide at one point in 2015, whatever it was, you know what, I'm going to create a Facebook page. I'm going to create a Twitter account. I'm going to set up a blog and turn into a website, and started a podcast. I did 5 episodes, all of 5 episodes. They still get watched. But I wish I had kept going, because I would have been like the first veterinary podcast, but I couldn't do all the stuff myself at that time. And it was a lot of work. But so that's a really important thing that I think is still just as valid as it was 10 years ago, is just putting yourself out there and establishing yourself as an expert in something. And even if you're not an expert, maybe a participant in something, and people begin to recognize your name and you get to be part of the conversation. I mean, it happens all over the internet all day, every day, whether it's Discord channels or Facebook groups or Reddit subs, and every day there's people establishing themselves as kind of, this is a go-to person who knows something about something, and then it just comes down to kind of being willing to ask and contact people. I mean, even still, my siblings and my wife and her siblings will laugh when they hear what I emailed someone to ask for, um,
Yep.
because they can't believe that I'm willing to just do that. um, and I think, and I've tried with all my siblings, my wife's siblings and cousins stuff, to kind of encourage them to come along this online business journey, and no one has taken me up on it yet. I was really sad and disappointed about that for a while, and kind of have gotten over it and realized it's not for everyone. But I think for the people who are interested in being successful in that, then the path is still wide open and the opportunity is there. And it really is as simple as you hear on these podcasts. It's just getting the account set up, starting to engage in the conversation, starting to create content of some sort, whether that's written or short videos or podcast or something. But you get involved in the conversations and you start to become someone who is worth talking to.
We've kind of gone through your greatest hits album, if you will, but I was preparing for the podcast and kind of, looking a little more into some of the things about you. And we've only covered a handful of things. Like, you've got a New York Times article that you published. You've written several books to my knowledge. One of them being like a thriller book. Another one being more of a short story that's kind of related to your time in the service. I'm sure I only know about a few things. Like, you have this knack of continually putting yourself out there. And I mean, again, we talked about your businesses that have gone on to be sold and you've gone on to be hired for, but like, you do have this, it seems, this thing of trying stuff, seeing what works, continuing on the stuff that is working, but always trying stuff. Like, can you talk about, again, some of the stuff I found, but just the impetus behind all these projects that you got your hands in?
Yeah. Again, I don't know if this is just something I was born with or what, but I'm a hustler at heart. um, and I'm sure it has all sorts of weird psychological things from my childhood, but part of it was, like I said, growing up kind of very straight middle class, but my parents being aspirational about the communities that we were involved in. So went to kind of schools with mostly kids who are a lot better off than us. And so was exposed to um, different types of lifestyles and stability in life. And for me, never wanted the huge house in the suburbs, but always dreamed of growing up on a farm, and never got to. And so that was a big thing that I've always aspired to, is having that. In addition to the writing stuff, my wife and I also are into real estate, and do a lot of work, my wife especially, on our vacation rentals, which was kind of another boom time thing that we got involved in a few
Good
years
grief. I didn't even find that. Didn't
ago.
know about that one.
I'm sitting right now in our farm, which we rent out as a vacation rental, the main 1840s farmhouse. And so it's just a lot of little pieces that we put together. And realistically, I mean, it takes hard work and takes choosing to work on something instead of watching a TV series at night. And we love doing that too. And we'll have something that we do every few nights or so together. But a lot of evenings we're sitting side by side in bed working on our laptops and working for other things that we care about and aspire to. So
Elliott Garber, the modern Renaissance hustler.
that's overly generous.
We're gonna call you. I don't know if it is.
Yeah.
Hey, with the last few minutes we have, obviously you're working on something new and exciting. I feel like I can say that now after spending 45 minutes with you. What's next? What are you working on now? You did tease it at a side. You shut down an e-commerce project to focus on something new. What are you working on here as we kind of close out?
Yeah, so I'm really excited about this new project. That's at creatures.com. It's the only premium domain I've ever bought. Spent more than I ever thought I would, but it wasn't something crazy like you see people talking about online. But it was another thing that I just put myself out there domain wasn't for sale, but I was thinking up kind of names for this new project, something around animals, and wanted something that could really be a brand, if possible. And so reached out to the retired old lady who
Of
had
course you
started
did.
this domain.
I'd expect no less.
Yeah. When she was, yeah, back in the 90s, she was probably one of the first 100 websites or
Yeah.
something.
Like, that
Um,
could come in handy someday. That's a nice domain name.
yeah. And so she had had some personal projects on it over the years, but reached out, and she thought about it on and off for a couple months as I kept following up, and then sold it to me. And so creatures.com is going to be kind of online home for animal business people of all sorts. And so we're working on providing software tools and a marketplace and community for people who keep and take care of animals, in not just kind of the pet owners, but more the people who make small businesses out of it. So people who breed a variety of animals and people who provide services for animals, whether it's the boarding facilities or transporters or things like that. And I had just kind of, after buying the farm 2.5 years ago, I've populated it with miniature Scottish Highland cattle and miniature donkeys, and have realized as I've gotten into those little crazy niche breeds of animals that there still somehow in 2025 isn't a great way to buy and sell live animals online. And part of that is because all the big online marketplaces specifically don't allow animal sales because of kind of welfare and ethical concerns, and it's just not worth their while to get into that controversial topic and subject. So Facebook Marketplace doesn't allow it, eBay doesn't allow it, Amazon, of course, Etsy, no one allows live animals. And so unfortunately, that means there's a ton of scams and
Yeah.
people getting caught up in all sorts of crazy stuff because there's not a safe, transparent, kind of trusted marketplace for that. And so that's the primary thing that we're building. But as a way to bring in the whole crew of animal folks, we're providing some useful software tools for them to actually manage those businesses too.
That makes complete sense. I have a personal story about that, but
Oh yeah.
no one will care about that.
Yes.
Not on this
Yeah,
podcast.
I've always enjoyed when you guys have covered kind of the funny animal related, like super niche websites,
Yes. Yeah. On the
which
weirdest
were
segment.
yeah, the horse name generator, which I now have one on my site, which
You-
isn't public yet. Yeah.
that was a
Um,
good one. That was one of the better ones. I agree with
yeah.
that.
And then there's all sorts of directories. So we're going to be the directory of directories for all things animal related.
I
And I
love it.
think at
Okay.
creatures.com, you have a place for that. So yeah.
That'll give the listeners a lot of a good mental picture.
Yeah.
Elliot, this has been a really fun deep dive into a really fun entrepreneurial story. But again, it just seems like everything you touch seems to turn to gold.
I wish. Not quite.
It's you got a great story. Thank you for your service. Thank you for sharing all of your successes and failures to some degree with the community here. I'm glad to have had you on. Where can people connect with you or follow along with what you're doing going forward? Because I'm sure there'll be many more things you'll be working on going forward.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, for your audience, if there's anyone who loves animals, then would love to have you connect on for the New Creatures platform. There's basically a landing page there now with an email collection. I do have a Facebook page and TikTok. I mean, not TikTok, X and Twitter. I'm kind of very active as an engager, not as much of a producer of content currently, but that hopefully going to change that. And then on YouTube, and I'll get you the links for all those things where people can follow along. But always happy. I have a personal website too. That's kind of what started it off, and happy to get emails through there with anyone with specific questions.
Elliot, thank you so much for jumping on board. This has been a really inspiring interview, and much continued success in all the projects you're working on to this day.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. It's fun to be on here.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening to the Niche Pursuits podcast. I just wanted to remind you that if you are ready to start building smarter, faster, and easier internal links, you should check out Link Whisper. You can get $15 off Link Whisper when you use the coupon code PODCAST at checkout. Head over to linkwhisper.com and use the code PODCAST in order to save $15. Thanks again for listening.